In the spring of 1945, across Europe and the Pacific, a dangerous idea began to spread among soldiers on every front. They thought the war was over, not officially, not on paper, but in their minds, in their posture, in the way men stood guard and the way they stopped checking the horizon as carefully as before. The great enemy armies were collapsing, cities were falling without resistance, flags were changing overnight. Radio broadcasts spoke openly about surrender, about negotiations, about the end. And yet, the war was not finished. Before we continue, remember to subscribe. These stories are not about victories or famous battles. They are about the moments history almost forgets. Moments when men died, not because the war demanded it, but because the war refused to end cleanly. Europe, early 1945. By March 1945, Allied forces were pouring into Germany from every direction. The Rhine had been crossed. German resistance, once rigid and terrifying, was crumbling into fragments. Entire units surrendered without firing a shot. Civilians waved white cloths from windows. Roads were clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers who no longer believed in victory. American, British, and Canadian troops advanced at a pace unimaginable just months earlier. For many soldiers, the fear that had governed their lives since Normandy began to fade. The front lines were no longer clear. Danger felt distant, abstract. The enemy appeared beaten. This shift was subtle but real. Officers noticed it first. Men became less strict about formations. Helmets were loosened. Patrols moved faster, sometimes carelessly. Checkpoints waved vehicles through with minimal inspection. After years of constant tension, the human mind began to relax, and that relaxation was deadly. German resistance had not vanished. It had fractured. The problem with a collapsing enemy: when an army collapses, it does not simply disappear. It breaks into pieces. In 1945, Germany was filled with isolated units, cut-off garrisons, rear area troops, and soldiers who had been told contradictory things by contradictory commanders. Some had orders to surrender. Others had orders to fight to the last bullet. Many had no orders at all. Communication was shattered. Radio networks were destroyed. Telephone lines were cut. Commanders were dead, missing, or fleeing. In this chaos, violence did not stop. It became unpredictable. A German soldier in 1945 might surrender in the morning, ambush a patrol in the afternoon, and disappear into the woods by nightfall. To Allied troops, this was confusing and dangerous. There was no longer a clear front. The war leaked into places where men believed it no longer existed. The illusion of safety. By April, rumors spread faster than orders. Berlin is surrounded. Hitler is dead. The Germans are giving up. The war will be over any day now. None of these statements were officially confirmed at the time, but they shaped behavior anyway. Soldiers began to think in terms of after. After the war, it'll go home. After this push, it'll be finished. After today, there won't be any more fighting. This mindset crept in even among experienced veterans. In rear areas, guards became routine assignments instead of high-risk duties. Supply convoys traveled roads that had been considered dangerous only weeks earlier. Patrols were sent out with reduced caution because nothing happens here anymore. Then it happened. Deaths after victory across Europe. Men began to die in places that were supposed to be safe. A jeep slowed at a crossroads and was hit by a hidden machine gun. A checkpoint waved through a truck carrying armed German soldiers who opened fire moments later. A patrol entered a village that had already surrendered and was ambushed from an attic window. These were not large battles. They did not change the course of the war. They did not appear in headlines, but they killed men who believed the worst was behind them. One American infantry officer later wrote, "We weren't scared anymore. That's what killed us." The Pacific, a different kind of ending while Europe moved toward surrender. The Pacific War followed a far more brutal path. In 1945, American forces advanced island by island toward Japan. Every battle reinforced a terrifying truth: the enemy did not surrender easily. And sometimes not at all. But even here, the idea that the war was almost over crept in. After Iwo Jima, after Okinawa, after the bombing of Japanese cities, each milestone made soldiers believe the next one would be the last. They were wrong. Japanese units continued to fight even when isolated, starving, and hopeless. Orders to surrender were ignored. Some units never received them. Others chose death over compliance. In this environment, moments of reduced vigilance were fatal. Friendly territory that wasn't. In early 1945, American troops moved through areas of the Philippines and Okinawa that had been declared secure. Maps were updated. Units rotated out. Replacement troops arrived believing the fighting was finished. It wasn't. Hidden positions remained active. Isolated Japanese soldiers waited for days, sometimes weeks, before attacking again. Some launched night assaults long after the main battle had moved elsewhere. Others targeted medics, engineers, or rear area personnel who no longer expected contact. These attacks did not stop the advance. They only added names to casualty lists. The psychological cost. What made these deaths especially hard to accept was their timing. Man had survived landings, artillery barrages, air raids, and months of combat, only to be killed when the war was supposedly ending. Families back home received telegrams weeks after hearing the war was almost over. Officers struggled to explain losses that felt pointless even to themselves. And among soldiers, a quiet bitterness began to form, not toward the enemy, but toward the idea that the war had an ending at all. Victory is not a switch. Wars do not end when people decide they should. They end when the last armed man stops fighting. In 1945, that truth was learned the hard way by thousands of soldiers who relaxed just a little too soon. They stood guard on roads they believed were safe. They entered buildings they believed were empty. They trusted silence. The war punished them for it. And this was only the beginning. In the final months of 1945, the number of men killed after victory would continue to rise, not because the war intensified, but because it refused to die quietly. In Part 2, we will follow specific incidents, documented cases where soldiers died days, hours, and sometimes minutes after the war was believed to be over, and why those moments reveal something deeply unsettling about how wars actually end. By late April 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany accelerated faster than anyone had predicted. Entire regions changed hands in days. Towns surrendered without resistance. German soldiers appeared at Allied lines in groups, sometimes unarmed, sometimes still carrying weapons but no longer willing to fight. From a distance, it looked like the war was ending cleanly. Up close, it was chaos. The space between orders and reality, one of the most dangerous periods in any war, is the gap between intention and execution. In 1945, surrender orders existed, but they did not travel instantly. Germany's command structure was disintegrating. Messages moved slowly or not at all. Some units received partial instructions. Others received none. Many commanders acted on assumptions rather than confirmation. A German officer in Bavaria might believe surrender was inevitable and order is meant to stand down. Another, only a few kilometers away, might believe the opposite, that resistance was still required to protect civilians, delay the enemy, or simply obey standing orders. This created a battlefield with no rules. Allied troops could encounter a white flag in one village, then machine gun fire in the next. The myth of the rear area as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. The concept of a rear area began to dissolve. Supply depots, command posts, field hospitals, all were established in towns that had been declared secure. The assumption was logical. German units were retreating or surrendering. The front was moving east. These locations were behind the fighting, but the fighting no longer respected lines on a map. German soldiers who had avoided capture hid in forests, barns, ruins, and cellars. Some waited for opportunities to escape east. Others waited to strike. Some acted alone. Others acted in small groups, disconnected from any larger plan. To them, the war was not over. To Allied troops relaxing their guard, this misunderstanding was fatal. Checkpoints, convoys, and false calm. One of the most common sights of post-victory deaths was the road. Convoys moved constantly. Ammunition, fuel, food, prisoners, replacement troops. Roads that had been death traps months earlier now seemed quiet. Checkpoints became routine. Soldiers waved vehicles through with little inspection. German soldiers exploited this. In several documented cases, armed Germans approached checkpoints wearing mixed uniforms or civilian clothing. They waited until vehicles slowed, then opened fire at close range. Some attacks lasted seconds. Others triggered brief firefights that ended as quickly as they began. The attackers often escaped. The victims were usually support troops, drivers, engineers, clerks, medics, men who had survived the war only to die on roads believed to be safe. The last snipers were another persistent threat. Some German snipers continued operating independently long after organized resistance had ended. They selected targets carefully: officers, radio operators, men standing in the open. These were not tactical victories. They changed nothing, but they killed men who believed the war was finished. Allied units responded aggressively. Entire buildings were cleared. Suspected positions were destroyed. In some cases, villages that had surrendered peacefully suffered reprisals because a single shot had been fired from somewhere unseen. The end of the war did not bring clarity. It brought suspicion. April 30th, 1945, Hitler is dead. When news of Adolf Hitler's suicide began to spread, many soldiers believed this was the final signal. Surely now the fighting would stop. It didn't. Some German units refused to believe the reports. Others believed them and continued fighting anyway, convinced that surrender to the Soviets was worse than death. In the East, violence actually increased as German forces tried desperately to reach American lines instead. For Allied troops, this created a paradox. The enemy was defeated, yet more dangerous than ever. Deaths that felt unnecessary. What separated these final deaths from earlier losses was perception. Earlier in the war, death was expected. It was understood as part of the mission. In 1945, death felt out of place. Wrong. Almost accidental. Men were killed while smoking, while joking, while writing letters home, while standing watch in towns where children waved at them earlier that day. These moments shattered morale in a way major battles often did not. One American sergeant later recalled, "We had survived everything. Then someone got shot at a road sign. The Pacific refuses to end while Europe edged toward surrender. The Pacific showed no such signs." Japanese resistance in 1945 remained absolute. On Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and dozens of smaller islands, Japanese soldiers fought until annihilation. Many continued fighting even after being cut off entirely. Here too, the idea that the war was almost over proved deadly. American troops relaxed procedures after heavy fighting concluded, assuming remaining resistance was negligible. It wasn't. Japanese soldiers hid in caves, jungles, and ruins. Some waited days before attacking again. Others waited weeks. A few waited years. In this environment, victory announcements meant nothing. When silence becomes a weapon, one of the most dangerous signals in late 1945 was silence. Silence meant no enemy contact, but also no confirmation of safety. In both Europe and the Pacific, units learned that silence often preceded attack. Soldiers who had stopped scanning tree lines or windows paid for it. The war punished complacency more harshly than ignorance. The war's cruel timing, perhaps the cruelest aspect of these final deaths, was how close they came to the end. Men killed days before surrender, hours before ceasefires, minutes before orders reached their units. Families would later learn that their sons died after victory was already decided, but before it was officially declared. That distinction meant nothing to the dead, but it meant everything to those left behind. A war that refused closure. By early May 1945, the machinery of war slowed, but it did not stop. Even as surrender documents were prepared, even as commanders discussed post-war plans, men continued to die, not in decisive battles, but in fragments. The war did not end with a final shot. It faded unevenly, leaving behind a trail of deaths that felt increasingly meaningless. And those deaths forced a difficult realization. Victory does not protect you. Peace does not arrive all at once. And belief is not the same as safety. In Part 3, we will move into the final days. Documented cases of soldiers killed after official surrender, after ceasefires, and even after celebrations had begun, revealing how wars truly end, not with clarity, but with confusion. By early May 1945, the war in Europe had reached a strange, unstable state. Militarily, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Politically, surrender was being negotiated. Logistically, German forces were collapsing everywhere. Yet on the ground, the war behaved as if it did not know it was supposed to end. This was the most dangerous phase. May 78, 1945. The gap between signatures and silence. Germany signed the surrender documents on May 7, 1945. The formal ceasefire was scheduled to take effect late on May 8. Between those two moments existed a narrow window of time. less than 24 hours, during which the war was technically ending but practically still alive. In that window, men continued to fight. Some units never received the ceasefire order in time. Others received it but doubted its authenticity. A few commanders deliberately ignored it, believing the documents applied only to certain fronts or fearing what surrender might mean. If Soviet forces arrived first, this hesitation cost lives. In Czechoslovakia, Austria, northern Italy, and scattered regions of Germany, firefights broke out after surrender had already been agreed upon. In some cases, both sides believed the other was violating the ceasefire. In others, neither side knew it existed. For the soldiers involved, the distinction was meaningless. Men who died after victory was decided. Among the most unsettling cases are those where deaths occurred after the outcome of the war was already settled, not just almost over, but mathematically irreversible. American, British, and Soviet archives all contain reports marked with phrases like enemy action after surrender, hostilities continued despite ceasefire, contact made after official end. These phrases hide the reality behind them. A patrol sent out because the order to stop had not arrived, a sniper firing because he did not trust the silence, a checkpoint manning position attacked because someone believed surrender was a trick. In each case, men died because information moved slower than bullets, celebration and death existing side by side in some areas. Soldiers celebrated victory while others nearby were still fighting. There are documented cases of Allied troops drinking, singing, and firing celebratory shots into the air, while only kilometers away, units were engaged in lethal combat. The psychological contrast was extreme. One American division reported casualties on the same day its band played for a victory parade. In another instance, a British unit received ceasefire confirmation in the morning, only to lose men to artillery fire in the afternoon from a German unit that had not received the order. Victory did not arrive evenly. It arrived in fragments. The Soviet factor in Eastern Europe, the war's ending was especially violent. German units desperately attempted to move west, surrendering to Americans or British rather than Soviets. This created chaotic movement across front lines that no longer truly existed. Entire columns of German soldiers marched under white flags, only to be fired upon by other German units that believed surrender was treason. Soviet units, suspicious of sudden ceasefires, often continued advancing aggressively. In some cases, they treated all resistance as hostile regardless of surrender claims. For Allied soldiers caught in between, the situation was volatile. Shots were fired not because someone wanted to fight, but because no one trusted the end. The Pacific after August 1945, while Europe formally ended in May. The Pacific War dragged the concept of post-war deaths even further. After Japan announced its surrender in August 1945, fighting still occurred. Isolated Japanese units refused to believe the announcement. Others believed it but refused to comply. Some commanders chose suicide over surrender. Some soldiers continued ambushes, convinced the surrender was Allied deception. American troops landing on islands believed to be secured were attacked by holdouts, who had never received orders or had chosen to ignore them. In several documented cases, Japanese soldiers killed American troops weeks after surrender, only to surrender themselves once convinced the war was truly over. These were not acts of strategy. They were acts of disbelief. When orders contemplate, one of the most haunting patterns of 1945 is the number of men killed. After orders to stop fighting had already been issued, but had not yet reached them. Communications infrastructure was fragile. Radios failed. Messengers were delayed or killed. Orders were misunderstood or mistranslated. A ceasefire on paper meant nothing to a man holding a rifle without confirmation. Some soldiers died defending positions that no longer mattered. Others died attacking objectives that had already been abandoned. In hindsight, these deaths appear unnecessary. At the time, they were unavoidable. The human refusal to accept the end war conditions soldiers to expect danger. That conditioning does not disappear instantly. Many veterans later described an inability to believe the war was truly over. Silence felt suspicious. Calm felt artificial. Men kept weapons close even after surrender was announced. Some fired reflexively when startled. Some mistook movement for attack. Some simply could not stop thinking like soldiers. This psychological lag caused deaths on all sides. The body survived the war. The mind lagged behind. Last casualties, forgotten names. Most histories focus on the final battles. Very few focus on the final casualties. Men killed on May 8, on May 9, on August 15th, on days when newspapers were already printing headlines about peace. Their names rarely appear in popular accounts. Their deaths lack narrative. There is no climax, no resolution, only timing. A war that ends unevenly. The end of World War I exposed a reality often ignored. Wars do not stop cleanly. They dissolve. They fragment. They leave behind violence that outlives the reason for fighting. Men trained to survive chaos struggle most when chaos fades unevenly. In 1945, the most dangerous assumption was not that the enemy was strong, but that the enemy was finished. Because for many soldiers, the war's last moments were its most lethal. In Part 4, we will examine the final phase, how militaries tried to account for these deaths, how history categorized them, and why the phrase "the war was over" is often a lie told after the fact. When the shooting finally stopped, the paperwork began. For militaries, wars end with documents. For soldiers, wars end when the last shot misses them. Between those two moments lies a space history rarely examines. The accounting of deaths that occurred after victory had already been declared. World War I left thousands of such cases. They did not fit cleanly into categories. How militaries classified late deaths after 1945, Allied forces were faced with a problem. How to classify soldiers killed after surrender or ceasefire announcements. Were they combat casualties, accidents, friendly fire, war crimes? In many cases, the answer was unclear. Official records often used neutral language. Killed in action, circumstances unclear, died during post-hostility operations, fatal incident following cessation of combat. These phrases disguised the reality. Men were still dying because the war had not fully stopped, only changed shape. Some governments quietly absorbed these deaths into overall casualty figures, avoiding public focus. Others listed them separately, where they received little attention and even less explanation. Families were rarely told the full context. Deaths without meaning. What distinguished these final casualties was the absence of purpose. They were not killed securing a bridge, not capturing a hill, not delaying an enemy advance. They died because the system had not stopped fast enough. Veterans who witnessed these deaths struggled to process them. Many later said these losses disturbed them more than earlier combat fatalities, because there was no reason left to justify them. The war had already been won. Friendly fire after peace. One of the most underreported aspects of 1945 was the number of friendly fire incidents occurring after surrender. Nervous checkpoints, misidentified vehicles, celebratory gunfire mistaken for attack. In Europe and the Pacific alike, soldiers who had survived years of combat were killed by their own side in the war's final hours. Investigations were often brief. No one wanted to prolong the war by arguing over its last mistakes. The psychological damage of an unclear ending for many soldiers. The war's ending did not feel real. They had lived along in constant threat. The sudden absence of structure created confusion. Some units remained at high alert long after orders to stand down. Others relaxed too quickly. Both extremes proved dangerous. Veterans later described the transition as disorienting. They no longer knew how to behave. They had survived by assuming the worst, and now they were told the worst was over. The mind did not accept it immediately. This delay between reality and belief cost lives. The last shots that history forgot across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Isolated incidents continued. A German sniper firing at retreating troops after surrender. A Japanese holdout attacking a patrol weeks after August 15th. An Allied sentry firing at movement that turned out to be civilians. Each incident added names to casualty lists that history barely acknowledged. No medals followed. No memorials highlighted them. No decisive battles explained them. They were simply too late. Why these deaths matter is tempting to view these deaths as footnotes, but they reveal something essential about war. Wars are not machines that stop once switched off. They are systems that decay unevenly. Orders move slower than fear. Paper moves slower than bullets. Belief moves slower than habit. The men who died after victory were victims of momentum. The illusion of a clean ending. World War I is often remembered with clarity. Dates, signatures, surrender ceremonies. But on the ground, endings were chaotic. Men celebrated while others fought. Peace was announced while rifles were still loaded. Victory arrived in fragments, not all at once. The phrase "the war was over" was often spoken by people far from where the last shots were fired. How history chose to remember over time, these final deaths were absorbed into silence. They complicated the narrative of triumph. They raised uncomfortable questions. They reminded everyone that victory does not arrive gently. So history simplified. The war ended on a date. The fighting stopped. The world moved on. The men who died after that date were left behind by the story. What veterans remembered instead? Veterans remembered differently. They remembered tension after celebration. They remembered uncertainty after orders. They remembered losing friends when they thought survival was guaranteed. For them, the war did not end with surrender documents. It ended with the last funeral. The final truth of 1945 World War I did not end in a single moment. It ended in hundreds of small, uneven, often violent conclusions. Some men lived long enough to hear peace announced, and still did not survive it. They thought the war was over, and for that belief they paid the final price,